Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
I've always been a sound sleeper, at least, I thought I was. I could fall asleep anywhere, planes, couches, even in the middle of Mia's cheesy horror movie marathons. So, when she told me my sleep talking had become a problem, I shrugged it off. People mumble in their sleep. It's harmless, right? Apparently not. You don't understand, Aaron, Mia had said, her voice trembling as she stuffed her clothes into a duffel bag. She wasn't yelling or crying. It was worse. She was calm, like she'd already decided there was no fixing this. It's not just sleep talking. It's different. Different how? I asked, trying to stay composed. Mia, you're freaking me out. Just tell me what I said. But she wouldn't. She just shook her head, pale and hollow-eyed, like she hadn't slept in weeks. It's not what you said, it's how you said it. It didn't sound like you. I can't explain it, Aaron. I can't stay here anymore. And then she was gone. 2 years together, unraveled in less than an hour. For days, her words echoed in my head. At first, I thought it was just an excuse. Maybe she was bored, or maybe there was someone else. But no matter how I tried to dismiss it, I couldn't shake the way she looked at me that night. She was scared. Of me. So, after a week of stewing in my own confusion, I decided to figure it out myself. If my sleep talking had really gotten that bad, I'd record it. Maybe I'd catch something weird, send it to Mia, and we'd laugh about how ridiculous it was. Maybe it'd help her come back. The first night was completely uneventful. I set my phone on the nightstand, hit record, and went asleep. In the morning, I played it back as I sipped my coffee, expecting to hear some harmless gibberish. And that's exactly what I got. Incoherent mumbling about the green folder and a lot of blanket rustling. The second and third nights were more of the same. I muttered about work, complained in my sleep about traffic, and groaned every time I rolled over. Normal stuff. Nothing to worry about. By the fourth night, I almost gave up. But something about Mia's reaction kept gnawing at me. She wasn't the type to just walk away without a reason, and she'd been so certain this wasn't normal. So I kept going. One more night, I told myself. Just one more. The fifth night felt different. I don't know how to explain it. It wasn't anything obvious, no flickering lights or doors slamming. But the air in the house felt heavier, colder. I chalked it up to my imagination and climbed into bed, trying to push the unease away. I didn't dream that night. Or, if I did, I don't remember it. I woke up feeling groggy and disoriented, the kind of morning where you can't tell if you've slept too much or not enough. As I reached for my phone, I hesitated. Did I really want to hear another hour of boring sleep noises? Something made me press play anyway. For the first 30 minutes, it was the same as always. Me mumbling about God knows what, tossing and turning, the occasional snore. Then, around 3 a.m., I heard it, a sound that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was just the wind. A low, raspy noise, faint and rhythmic, like breathing. But as I listened closer, my stomach twisted. It wasn't the wind. It was too steady, too deliberate. And it wasn't me. I paused the recording and rewound it, turning the volume all the way up. The sound was clearer now. Slow, heavy breaths, in and out, louder than anything else on the track. My heart started racing. Could it be Buddy? But then I remembered. Buddy wasn't home. Mia had taken him to her mom's place after she left. So what the hell was I hearing? I scrubbed through the audio, my pulse pounding in my ears. The breathing continued for almost a full minute, growing louder and more distinct. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. I let out a shaky breath, laughing nervously at myself. Maybe it was an audio glitch. Phones mess up sometimes, right? But then, just as I was about to close the app, I heard it. Aaron. The voice was low and distorted, almost like a growl. My name. Clear as day. I sat there, frozen, staring at the screen. My first thought was that it had to be me. Maybe I was talking in my sleep again, and it just sounded weird. I rewound the clip and listened to it over and over, comparing it to my earlier mumbling. It wasn't me. The voice was too deep, too slow. It sounded wrong, like it was coming from inside the recording itself. I played the clip again, this time with headphones. The voice was even clearer now. Aaron. It dragged out my name, low and guttural, almost like it was savoring the sound. The recording ended soon after that. I sat there for what felt like hours, replaying the clip, trying to make sense of it. It had to be a prank, I told myself. Maybe Mia had recorded something before she left, and planted it on my phone. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. Mia was terrified of whatever this was. She wouldn't mess with me like that, which left only one possibility. Something else had been in the room with me that night. Something that wasn't me, and it knew my name. The fifth night began like all the others. I set my phone on the nightstand, hit record, and climbed into bed, trying to ignore the chill that seemed to creep through the room. The house was quiet except for the usual hum of the fridge and the faint groans of the old pipes. I tried to focus on the idea that this would be another useless recording, an hour or so of my nonsensical mumbling. Still, a nagging unease stayed with me as I drifted off. The next morning, I woke up groggy. The kind of groggy that makes you feel like you barely slept at all. My muscles ached like I'd been tossing and turning all night, though I didn't remember waking up once. I reached for my phone, hesitating for a moment before pressing play. The first 30 minutes were what I expected. Blanket rustling, me mumbling something incomprehensible, the occasional deep sigh. I was just about to toss the phone aside when I heard it. A breath. It was faint at first, barely noticeable under the rustling sounds, but unmistakably there. Slow, deliberate, raspy. My initial reaction was to shrug it off. It had to be me, right? But as I kept listening, I realized it wasn't. The timing was off. The breathing didn't match mine. It was deeper, heavier. Then I remembered something that made my stomach drop. Buddy wasn't home. The thought hit me like a slap. My dog had been staying at Mia's mom's place since she left. There was no other living thing in the house. I rewound the clip, turning the volume up as high as it would go. My ears strained against the sound of the blankets and faint static, focusing on the breath. It was even louder now, almost too loud for a phone microphone to capture naturally. That's when I heard it. Aaron. The voice dragged out my name, slow and distorted, each syllable laced with a guttural resonance. My blood went cold. I sat frozen, staring at my phone like it might suddenly explode. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't think. The voice wasn't mine. It couldn't be mine. My brain immediately went into overdrive, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. Maybe the phone glitched? Maybe it picked up some weird interference? I knew both explanations were long shots, but I clung to them like a life raft. Anything was better than the alternative. I replayed the clip again, this time using headphones. The voice was clearer now, impossibly deep, almost inhuman. It didn't sound angry or urgent, but there was something undeniably sinister about it. It didn't just say my name. It lingered on it, savoring each sound like it knew I was listening. I played the clip again and again, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but the more I listened, the more certain I became. This wasn't just a random sound. It wasn't an accident. It was calling me. That night, I couldn't focus on anything. I tried distracting myself with TV, scrolling through social media, even cleaning out my junk drawer, anything to keep my mind off that voice. But it was no use. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it. By the time I climbed into bed, I was a bundle of nerves. The room felt colder than usual, though I hadn't touched the thermostat. Every creak and groan of the house made me flinch. I didn't want to record again, but I couldn't stop myself. I needed to know. When I hit record and turned off the lights, the darkness felt heavier than before. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart pounding. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I slipped into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke up with the same bone-deep grogginess as the day before. My chest was tight, and a dull ache throbbed at the back of my skull. I grabbed my phone with trembling hands, dreading what I might hear. This time, the breathing started earlier in the night. It was quieter, almost like it was testing the waters, but still there, slow, deep, and deliberate. And then, just like before, Aaron. The voice was louder this time, more distinct. My stomach twisted into knots as I scrubbed through the recording, searching for anything else. I expected the breathing to fade, for the voice to disappear into the white noise. But it didn't. Instead, the voice came back. Aaron. The second time was sharper, more forceful, as if it was trying to get my attention. Aaron, come. The recording cut off abruptly, leaving me staring at the phone in horrified silence. I couldn't stay in the house after that. I grabbed my keys and left, driving aimlessly through town until I ended up in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner. The early morning air was cold and damp, but it felt better than being trapped inside with whatever that was. As I sat in my car, sipping lukewarm coffee from a styrofoam cup, I tried to make sense of it all. There had to be an explanation. Interference, sleepwalking, something. But deep down, I knew the truth. The voice wasn't random. It knew my name, and it wanted something from me. That was the moment I decided to call Mia. After sitting in the diner parking lot for what felt like hours, I finally mustered the courage to call Mia. It wasn't an easy decision. I didn't know how she'd react, if she'd even pick up, but I needed answers. I needed to know if she had heard the same thing I was hearing. The phone rang 3 times before her voice came through, hesitant and guarded. Aaron? Mia, please don't hang up, I blurted out, my words tumbling over each other. I need to talk to you. It's important. She was silent for a moment, then sighed. What is it? I've been recording myself while I sleep, I said, my voice trembling. I've been hearing things, Mia. Weird things. Breathing. A voice. It's saying my name. Her sharp intake of breath told me everything I needed to know. I knew it, she whispered. Knew what? Mia, what the hell is going on? Did you hear it too? Her voice wavered when she answered. Yes. I didn't want to tell you because I thought you wouldn't believe me. Or worse, I thought you'd think I was crazy. But it's not just you, Aaron. It wasn't you. There was something else in that house. I don't know what, but it wasn't human. I felt a cold chill creep down my spine. You're serious? Why would I lie about this? She snapped, frustration and fear bleeding into her voice. I started hearing it months ago. At first, it was faint, like a whisper in the background of your sleep talking. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination. But then it got louder, clearer. It was saying your name, Aaron. It was calling to you. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. If Mia had been hearing the voice for months, this wasn't just some recent glitch or figment of my imagination. This thing had been there the whole time, watching, waiting. Mia, why didn't you tell me? I asked, my voice cracking. I tried. She shot back, her voice breaking. I hinted at it. I told you something wasn't right, but you brushed it off every time. And when it got worse, I didn't know how to bring it up without sounding insane. What was I supposed to say? Hey, Aaron, I think your house is haunted? You would have laughed at me. I couldn't argue. I would have dismissed it as paranoia back then. But now, after hearing the voice myself, I couldn't deny it. I pressed her for more details. What exactly did you hear? Did it say anything else besides my name? She hesitated, and I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line, shaky and uneven. It would say things like, Aaron, come closer, or Aaron, listen. It sounded like it was coming from the walls. I started sleeping with earplugs, but even then, I'd wake up in the middle of the night feeling like something was staring at me. My stomach churned. And you never saw anything? No, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But I felt it. You know how you can feel when someone's standing behind you, even if you can't see them? It was like that, but stronger. It got so bad I couldn't sleep at all. I'd lie there for hours, too scared to close my eyes. Her words painted a vivid, terrifying picture in my mind. I imagined her lying in bed, wide-eyed and trembling, while that voice whispered my name in the darkness. What made you leave? I asked. The last night I stayed there, she said, her voice quivering. The voice wasn't coming from the walls anymore. It was right next to me. I could feel the breath on my neck. Aaron. And it didn't just say your name that time. It told me to leave. It said I didn't belong there. A lump formed in my throat. And you didn't think to warn me? I tried to, but you didn't want to hear it, she said, defensive. And honestly, I was scared. I didn't want to deal with it anymore. I thought if I left, it would stop. But it didn't, did it? No, I said, staring blankly at the dashboard of my car. It didn't. After that, she refused to say anything else. Aaron, I can't do this. I'm sorry, but I don't want to talk about it anymore. Just leave the house. Don't stay there alone. Then she hung up. I sat in my car, phone still clutched in my hand, trying to process everything she told me. The voice, the feeling of being watched, the whispers coming from the walls. It wasn't new. It had been there for weeks, maybe months, and I had ignored it. That night, I didn't record myself. I couldn't. The thought of hearing the voice again made my skin crawl. Instead, I sat on the couch with all the lights on, clutching a baseball bat like it would somehow protect me. The house felt different now. The silence wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, heavy. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant groan of the pipes, sent my heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At one point, I thought I heard something, a faint rustling sound coming from the direction of the bedroom. I froze, gripping the bat tighter, my knuckles white. Hello? I called out, my voice trembling. Nothing. I sat there, staring at the hallway, for what felt like an eternity. Eventually, the noise stopped, but the unease didn't go away. The next day, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let this thing scare me out of my own house. I'd already lost Mia because of it. I wasn't about to let it take anything else. If it wanted my attention, it had it. That night, I set up my phone again, this time with a video recorder. I propped it up on the dresser, making sure it had a clear view of the entire bedroom. If something was in the house with me, I was going to catch it. I climbed into bed, my heart pounding, and turned off the lights. The darkness felt suffocating, and every fiber of my being screamed at me to get out of the house. But I stayed. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I whispered to myself, this time, I'll know. Little did I realize, I wouldn't be ready for what came next. By the sixth night, fear had become my constant companion. It was no longer just a feeling. It was an atmosphere that clung to me, heavy and cold. Every night was the same routine. I'd set up my phone, brace myself for whatever new horror might appear, and lie in bed, unable to sleep until exhaustion finally dragged me under. That night, the house felt even worse. It was colder than usual, and the air was heavy, pressing against me like the weight of an unseen hand. I told myself it was my imagination, that the fear was getting to me. But deep down, I knew better. The darkness in the bedroom seemed thicker, as though it wasn't just an absence of light, but something alive. I set the phone on the dresser, aimed the camera toward the bed, and hit record. As I lay down, pulling the blanket up to my chin, I whispered to myself, this time, I'll know. I must have fallen asleep eventually because the next thing I remembered was waking up in a cold sweat. My eyes snapped open, and I was immediately aware of two things. The room was unnaturally silent, and I wasn't alone. I didn't move, didn't even breathe, straining my ears for any sound. And then I heard it. Aaron. The voice was unmistakable, low and distorted, like a growl echoing through a hollow space. But this time, it wasn't coming from the phone. It was in the room with me. My body froze, every muscle tensing as the voice spoke again, louder now. Come downstairs. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't know what to do. Pretend I hadn't heard it? Stay in bed and hope it would go away? But the voice had sounded so close, as if it were standing right next to me. I slowly turned my head toward the dresser, where the phone sat, its tiny red recording light still blinking. My first instinct was to grab it and check the footage, but another part of me, the part that was drowning in terror, screamed at me to stay still. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The voice didn't come again, but the silence was almost worse. The house felt alive, like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to move. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I reached for my phone, my hand trembling as I gripped it. The recording was still going. I hit stop and immediately switched to playback mode. The first few minutes of the recording were normal, me tossing and turning, mumbling something incoherent in my sleep. Then, around 3 a.m., the breathing started. It was louder this time, more insistent, like it was coming from right beside the microphone. My stomach twisted as I listened, dread pooling in my chest. The breathing continued for nearly a minute before the voice came. Aaron. Hearing it again, even on the recording, sent a chill down my spine. The voice was so clear, so deliberate. But what came next made my blood run cold. Come downstairs. The words were drawn out, slow and guttural, dripping with malice. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command. As I listened, I became painfully aware of how quiet the house had become. No creaking floorboards, no hum of the refrigerator, just silence. The kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to know what was going on. Grabbing my flashlight, I climbed out of bed, my legs shaky and unsteady. The cold air bit at my skin as I crept toward the bedroom door. Every step felt like a monumental effort, as though the house itself was resisting me. The hallway stretched out in front of me, dark and uninviting. I shone the flashlight ahead, the beam cutting through the shadows. Everything looked normal, just the same creaky wooden floor and faded wallpaper I'd walked past 1,000 times. But it didn't feel normal. I reached the top of the stairs and stopped, my breath hitching in my throat. The darkness below was impenetrable, a solid wall of black that seemed to swallow the light from my flashlight. I swallowed hard, gripping the banister for support. Aaron. The voice came again, clearer this time, as if it were floating up the stairs to meet me. Come. Downstairs? My entire body was screaming at me to turn back, to run back to my room, lock the door, and never come out. But I couldn't. Something compelled me to move forward, one shaky step at a time. The stairs creaked under my weight, each sound echoing through the silent house like a gunshot. The air grew colder with every step, wrapping around me like a suffocating shroud. By the time I reached the bottom, my heart was racing so fast I thought I might pass out. I shone the flashlight around the living room, searching for anything out of place. The furniture was exactly as I'd left it: couch, coffee table, bookshelves lined with mismatched paperbacks. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I took a cautious step forward, the flashlight beam flickering slightly as I scanned the room. The shadows seemed to shift, almost imperceptibly, as though something was moving just out of sight. And then I saw it. The basement door. It was open, just a crack, but enough for me to see the darkness beyond. My stomach churned. I was certain I'd closed it earlier. I always kept it closed. It was one of those old, heavy doors that didn't stay open on its own. But now it hung there, slightly ajar, almost inviting. The voice came again, softer this time, but no less insistent. "Aaron, come downstairs." My flashlight wavered as my hand began to tremble. I didn't want to go down there. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn back, to run as far from that door as I could. But I couldn't move. It was like something was pulling me forward, dragging me toward the gaping maw of the basement. I took a step closer, then another, until I was standing in front of the door. The cold air spilling out from the basement was almost unbearable, biting at my skin like icy fingers. My hand reached for the doorknob, shaking uncontrollably as I pushed the door open. The staircase loomed before me, descending into pitch-black nothingness. The air was heavier down here, thicker, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. I shone the flashlight down the steps, my breath catching in my throat as the beam revealed nothing. Just the same old concrete walls and dusty floor I'd seen 100 times before. But I knew I wasn't alone. "Aaron." The voice was right behind me. The living room was empty, but it didn't feel empty. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of something unseen. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, darker, as though they weren't just shadows but something alive, watching me. And then there was the basement door. It was open, just a crack. I stopped in my tracks, my flashlight trembling in my hand. I was absolutely certain I had closed it earlier. I always closed it, partly because I didn't like the idea of leaving the basement open, and partly because the old door had a tendency to drift open slightly if it wasn't firmly latched. But this was no slight drift. The door was open enough to see the yawning darkness of the basement stairs beyond. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped closer. The door seemed to pull at me, almost magnetically, as if it were daring me to look inside. My mouth was dry, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. "Aaron." The voice came again, clearer and louder this time, cutting through the silence like a knife. "Come downstairs." I swung the flashlight toward the door, my breath catching in my throat as the beam illuminated the top of the staircase. The shadows down there moved, not from the light, but as if they were alive, writhing and twisting in ways that defied explanation. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. I regretted it instantly. The shadows seemed to respond, shifting slightly, as though something within them had heard me. The voice came again, softer this time, almost teasing. "Aaron, come downstairs." It wasn't a request. It was a command. My legs felt like lead as I took a step closer. The cold air spilling out from the basement hit me like a wave, making me shiver uncontrollably. It was the kind of cold that didn't just touch your skin but seemed to sink into your bones, pulling the warmth out of you. My hand reached out almost involuntarily, pushing the door open the rest of the way. The old hinges groaned loudly in the silence, the sound echoing down the dark staircase. I shone the flashlight down into the abyss, the beam barely penetrating the blackness. The basement looked the same as it always had: concrete walls, exposed pipes, stacks of old boxes collecting dust. But it felt different. It felt alive. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, torn between the primal urge to run and the irrational need to know what was down there. The voice hadn't come again, but the silence that followed was worse. It was heavy and oppressive, pressing against my chest like an unseen weight. Slowly, I took a step onto the first stair. The old wood creaked loudly beneath my foot, making me wince. My flashlight trembled as I moved it back and forth, scanning the darkness ahead. Another step, then another. The air grew colder and thicker with every step I took, as though the basement were swallowing me whole. By the time I reached the bottom, my breath was coming in short, shallow gasps. The flashlight beam swept across the room, revealing nothing but the same clutter and disarray that had always been there. Old holiday decorations in plastic bins, a broken chair leaning against the far wall, stacks of books no one had read in decades. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. Aaron. The voice came again, closer now, almost right behind me. I whipped around, the flashlight beam darting wildly across the room, but there was nothing there. I took a step backward, my pulse racing, my every instinct screaming at me to run. But before I could move, the flashlight flickered. Once, twice, and then it went out completely, plunging me into total darkness. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. The silence in the basement was absolute, broken only by the sound of my own ragged breathing. I fumbled with the flashlight, hitting it against my palm in a desperate attempt to get it working again. Aaron. The voice was right in front of me now, so close I could feel the vibration of it in my chest. Come closer. The darkness seemed to shift, pressing in on me from all sides. My fingers finally found the power button on the flashlight, and the beam snapped back on. I swung it around wildly, desperate to find the source of the voice. And that's when I saw it. In the far corner of the basement, just at the edge of the light, something moved. It was tall and hunched, its form barely distinguishable from the shadows around it. But it was there, watching me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The figure stepped forward, just enough for the light to catch it. Its shape was wrong. Elongated limbs, a hunched back, a face that was more void than anything human. Its presence radiated malice, a cold, suffocating hatred that seemed to seep into my very soul. The voice came again, but this time, it wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from everywhere at once, echoing through the walls and floor, vibrating in my chest. Aaron, you belong to me. The flashlight flickered again, and the figure moved closer, its movements slow and deliberate. I stumbled backward, tripping over an old box and falling hard onto the cold concrete floor. The figure loomed over me now, its shadow swallowing the light, its form becoming less distinct and more amorphous. I scrambled backward, my hands scraping against the rough floor, my flashlight tumbling out of my grip. Aaron, come with me? The words were almost a whisper now, soft and sickly sweet, as though it were mocking my fear. Somehow, I found my footing and bolted up the stairs, my legs shaking so badly I nearly fell twice. I didn't stop running until I was back in the living room, slamming the basement door shut behind me. The silence returned, heavy and oppressive, as though the house itself was holding its breath. My chest heaved as I leaned against the door, trying to calm the pounding in my ears. And then, from the other side of the door, the voice came one last time. Aaron, you can't run. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't even try. Instead, I sat on the couch with every light in the house turned on, clutching my phone in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other. But no matter how hard I tried to push it out of my mind, one thought kept gnawing at me. The thing in the basement wasn't just trying to scare me. It wanted me to follow it. The basement felt colder than ever, an unnatural chill that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. My breath fogged in the air as I descended the creaking wooden stairs, each step groaning under my weight. The flashlight in my hand shook so violently that its beam jittered across the concrete walls and scattered over the cluttered floor below. The silence was oppressive, like the house had swallowed all sound. No hum of the refrigerator upstairs, no distant car engines outside, just the rhythmic pounding of my own heart. And the smell. The air was damp, heavy with the sharp, metallic tang of something old and decaying. I gagged slightly, pulling my shirt over my nose as I scanned the room. The basement looked the same as always. Boxes of forgotten junk, a rusted tool chest, the faint glow of the water heater in the corner. Yet it felt entirely different, like a stage set up for something I couldn't yet see. As I reached the bottom step, the voice stopped. The silence was even worse than the sound of it calling me. A heavy, pregnant pause that seemed to stretch on forever. And then, I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another shadow cast by the flashlight's trembling beam. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized it wasn't the light playing tricks on me. It was a figure. It stood hunched in the far corner of the basement, its form barely distinguishable from the darkness around it. It was tall, so tall that its head seemed to scrape against the low ceiling. Its shoulders were impossibly broad, its arms hanging long and limp at its sides. But it wasn't human. The more I looked at it, the more wrong it seemed. Its limbs were too long, its posture too unnatural, its movements too slow and deliberate, like a puppet being manipulated by unseen strings. Its head tilted slightly to the side as if it were studying me, though I couldn't see its face. There was no face. Where features should have been, there was only a void a patch of darkness so complete it seemed to devour the light. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back, slamming into the cold concrete wall behind me. The flashlight beam quivered as I tried to steady it, but the figure didn't move. At least, not at first. The air grew thicker, colder, as if the basement itself were alive and reacting to my presence. My chest tightened, and I felt a crushing weight press down on me, making it hard to breathe. And then the figure moved. It didn't walk or step. It glided, a slow, deliberate motion that brought it closer to the edge of the flashlight's beam. The air filled with a deep, raspy breathing, uneven and wrong, like it was struggling to suck in air that wasn't meant for it. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there, but my body refused to cooperate. It was as if the figure's presence alone had paralyzed me, locking me in place while it approached. The beam of light flickered as the figure stopped just outside its reach. It stood there, unmoving, and the breathing grew louder, deeper, as though it were coming from right inside my chest. And then, it spoke. "Aaron, stay." The voice was deeper than I remembered, more guttural and primal, as if it weren't coming from a throat, but from the very air around me. Each syllable dragged out, slow and deliberate, like it was savoring the words. My knees nearly gave out as I pressed harder against the wall, desperate to put more distance between myself and the thing that had spoken. But there was nowhere to go. What do you want?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely audible over the sound of its breathing. It didn't answer. Instead, it tilted its head further, as if it were confused by my question, or amused. "Aaron." It said my name again, softer this time, almost a whisper. The way it said it felt intimate, personal, like it knew me, knew everything about me. And then it stepped into the light. I wish I could tell you what it looked like, but I can't. My mind won't let me. I remember the way its body twisted unnaturally as it moved, the way its limbs seemed to stretch and contract in ways that defied logic. I remember the void where its face should have been, a darkness so complete it felt like staring into the abyss. But the details? They're a blur, like a smudge on the edges of my memory, as if my brain refuses to hold onto the image for fear of what it might mean. The flashlight flickered again, the beam dimming for a split second before snapping back to life. When it did, the figure was closer, so close I could feel the cold radiating off it, like standing next to an open freezer. "Aaron, stay." The words echoed in my ears, louder and more insistent. It wasn't just speaking to me, it was commanding me. Something in me snapped. I don't know where the strength came from, but I managed to tear myself away from the wall and bolt up the stairs. My legs felt like lead, my chest burning as I stumbled over the steps, but I didn't stop. The flashlight clattered to the ground behind me, forgotten in my blind panic. As I reached the top of the stairs, I slammed the basement door shut with all the force I could muster, leaning my full weight against it as if that would be enough to keep it out. For a moment, there was silence. And then, from the other side of the door, the voice came again. "Aaron, you can't leave." The words sent a shiver down my spine, and I stumbled backward, my eyes darting around the room. The house was eerily quiet, but I could feel it, something pressing against the edges of reality, waiting for me to slip. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table, my hands shaking as I fumbled to call someone. Anyone. The screen blurred as I scrolled through my contacts, but before I could press dial, the lights in the living room flickered and went out. The darkness was suffocating, wrapping around me like a living thing. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, the breathing started again. Slow, deliberate, and getting closer. The moments after I fled the basement were a haze of terror and adrenaline. My mind has tried to erase the details, but fragments still surface when I least expect it. Snatches of heavy breathing behind me, the rasp of wood as my hand fumbled for the railing, the overwhelming sensation that something was right there, just inches away, ready to grab me. When I burst into the living room, it was as if I'd been plunged into an entirely different world. The house was still and silent, but the silence wasn't comforting. It felt alive, heavy with malice. I slammed the basement door shut, throwing my weight against it, as if that alone could keep whatever was down there from following me. My chest heaved as I gasped for air, my hands trembling uncontrollably. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, to get as far from this place as possible. But I couldn't move. I stood there, back pressed against the door, scanning the room for any sign that the thing from the basement had followed me. My eyes darted to the shadows in the corners, the darkened hallway leading to the kitchen, the windows that now seemed like portals to something darker than the night outside. And then, I felt it. A presence. It wasn't something I saw or heard, but something I felt. A cold, suffocating weight that pressed against the back of my neck. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The air around me felt thicker, colder, as though the house itself was holding its breath. I didn't dare turn around. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed, listening for the faintest hint of movement behind me. It could have been seconds, minutes, or even hours. Time seemed to stretch and twist in that moment, the oppressive silence warping my sense of reality. Finally, I forced myself to move. My fingers fumbled in my pocket for my keys, the sharp edges digging into my palm as I gripped them tightly. With a deep, shaky breath, I pushed off the door and stumbled toward the front of the house. Each step felt like a monumental effort, like the air itself was resisting me. My legs were heavy, my movements sluggish, but I refused to stop. I kept my eyes fixed on the door ahead, the faint glow of the streetlights outside my only beacon of hope. I reached the door and yanked it open, stepping out into the cool night air. It hit me like a wave, sharp and biting, but it was a relief. I didn't look back as I pulled the door shut behind me, the sound of the latch clicking into place echoing in the stillness. I was out. I didn't know where I was going or what I was running from exactly, but I knew I couldn't stay. I got into my car, my hands shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, the tires screeching against the pavement as I sped down the empty street. The streetlights blurred past as I drove aimlessly through the darkened neighborhood, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced with 1,000 questions I didn't want to answer. What had I seen in the basement? What was it? Why did it know my name? And, most hauntingly, why had it told me to stay? As the adrenaline began to fade, the fear took on a different form. It wasn't the sharp, immediate terror I'd felt in the basement. It was a deeper, more insidious dread. No matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't truly escaped. The air in the car felt stifling, even with the windows cracked open. My chest tightened as I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something sitting in the back seat. But the mirror reflected only darkness, the faint glow of the dashboard lights casting eerie shadows across the upholstery. Still, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white, as I turned onto another unfamiliar street. The houses here looked the same as every other neighborhood I'd passed, silent, dark, and lifeless. It was as if the entire world had gone still, holding its breath alongside me. My phone buzzed in the passenger seat, breaking the silence. The sudden noise made me jump, my heart leaping into my throat. For a split second, I considered ignoring it, but curiosity won out. I reached over, my fingers brushing against the screen as I glanced down. It was a message. Unknown number. Aaron, you can't leave. The car swerved as I jerked the wheel, my eyes darting back to the road. My heart was hammering in my chest, my breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands shaking as I grabbed the phone. My thumb hovered over the screen, debating whether or not to open the message. My mind screamed at me not to throw the phone out the window and keep driving. But I opened it. The message was brief, just those 4 words, but they felt heavier than anything I'd ever read. I stared at the screen, my vision blurring as the weight of it sank in. It wasn't over. I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat and slammed the car into gear, pulling back onto the road with a screech of tires. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stop. Not yet. Not until I was sure I was safe. The streets grew darker as I left the neighborhood, the streetlights becoming fewer and farther between. I tried to focus on the road ahead, but my mind kept drifting back to the message. How had it known I was leaving? My hands tightened on the wheel as the memory of the figure in the basement surfaced again. Its hunched form, its impossible shape, the way its voice had wrapped around my name like a curse, and the way it had told me to stay. I drove for hours, the city giving way to open fields and winding roads. The silence in the car was deafening, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the seat as I shifted. But no matter how far I drove, the feeling lingered, that suffocating, inescapable sense that I wasn't alone. Finally, as the first rays of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I pulled into the parking lot of an all-night diner. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow over the cracked asphalt. I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the empty diner and the darkened road beyond. My hands still gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, as if letting go would make it all real. Eventually, I forced myself to get out of the car. The cool morning air was sharp against my skin, a small comfort in the suffocating weight of the night's events. I stepped into the diner, the door jangling softly behind me. The waitress didn't even look up as I slid into a booth by the window. I ordered coffee, black, and stared out at the empty road, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. But no matter how hard I tried, one thought kept gnawing at the edges of my mind. The voice wasn't finished with me. After the diner, I couldn't bring myself to go home. The thought of stepping back into that house made my skin crawl. I needed to get away, to clear my head, but I didn't know where to go. That's when I called Matt. Matt and I hadn't spoken much in the last few years, but he was the kind of guy who lived for the strange and unexplained. Back in college, he'd spent most of his free time diving into paranormal forums, chasing urban legends, and poking around in abandoned buildings with his EMF detector. If anyone could make sense of what was happening to me, it was Matt. When I told him what I'd been experiencing, he didn't laugh or brush me off. Instead, there was a long pause before he said, "Aaron, pack a bag and come to my place. Don't go back to that house. I'll help you figure this out." I arrived at Matt's apartment later that morning, bleary-eyed and shaking from exhaustion. He greeted me at the door, his face serious, and ushered me inside without a word. His living room looked like the control center for a ghost-hunting TV show, equipment scattered everywhere, from audio recorders to night vision cameras and motion detectors. "I've seen some weird stuff, but this sounds different," he said as he handed me a cup of coffee. "We need to figure out what we're dealing with." He didn't waste any time. Over the next few hours, Matt and I pored over the recordings I'd made, dissecting every sound, every whisper. When we reached the fifth and sixth nights, his expression darkened. "That voice," he said, rewinding the clip where it said my name. "It's not natural. It's not just a glitch or interference. This is something else." "What kind of something?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Matt shook his head. "I don't know, but we're going to find out." That night, Matt insisted on setting up his equipment. "We need more data," he said, pulling out a night vision camera and a thermal imaging device. "If this thing is attached to you, it might show up here too." The thought made my stomach turn, but I nodded. I didn't have a better plan. We set up the camera in the living room and the thermal imaging device pointed toward the guest room where I'd be sleeping. Matt positioned an audio recorder on the nightstand and handed me a small EMF detector. "If anything weird happens, this will spike," he explained. "Don't ignore it. Wake me up." I didn't think I'd be able to sleep at all, but exhaustion eventually overtook me. I drifted off in the unfamiliar room, the glow of the recorder's red light the only comfort in the darkness. When I woke up the next morning, Matt was already hunched over his laptop, headphones on, scrolling through hours of footage. His face was pale, and his jaw was clenched. "What did you find?" I asked, my voice hoarse. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned the laptop toward me and hit play. The video showed me lying in bed, tossing and turning. For the first couple of hours, nothing unusual happened. Then, around 3 a.m., the EMF detector on the nightstand began to spike. At first, it was subtle, a flicker of light, a faint beep. But then it went wild, the lights flashing in rapid succession as the beeping grew louder. And then came the voice. "Aaron." Hearing it again made my stomach churn, but this time, it wasn't just calling my name. It was speaking directly into the recorder, clear and deliberate. "Why did you leave?" I felt the blood drain from my face. "That's not all," Matt said grimly. He fast-forwarded to another section of the footage. The camera was focused on the thermal imaging device, which showed the bed and the surrounding room in shades of blue and green. As the voice spoke, a shape began to form on the screen. A tall, hunched figure standing at the foot of the bed. It didn't move. It didn't breathe. It just stood there, watching. Matt and I spent the next 2 days researching, diving into every paranormal forum and obscure website we could find. The more we read, the more patterns began to emerge. There were stories of voices calling out to people in the dead of night, always starting as faint whispers before growing louder, more insistent. In every account, the voice would eventually issue a command, drawing the person deeper into its grasp. And those who followed? They never came back. The stories were eerily similar. People hearing their names called, feeling a presence in their homes, being lured to basements, attics, or darkened rooms. Some reported seeing shadowy figures like the one I'd seen. Others described a suffocating cold, an overwhelming sense of dread. But no one could explain what the entities were or what they wanted. "This isn't just a haunting," Matt said, leaning back in his chair, his face drawn and tired. "It's something worse. I don't know what, but it's dangerous." Despite everything we'd uncovered, I knew there was only one way to get real answers. "We have to go back to the house," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Matt looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Are you serious? After everything we've seen, you want to go back there?" "I need to know what it wants," I said. "If I don't face it now, it'll follow me forever. I can feel it." Matt hesitated, then sighed. "Fine, but we're going in prepared." The plan was simple. We'd return to the house, set up as much equipment as possible, and try to provoke the entity into showing itself. It was risky. Matt didn't need to tell me that. But I couldn't live like this anymore, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the voice to find me again. We loaded Matt's car with cameras, audio recorders, and every piece of equipment he owned. As we drove toward the house, my stomach churned with a mix of fear and anticipation. When we pulled into the driveway, the house loomed before us, dark and foreboding. The sight of it made my chest tighten, memories of the basement flooding back in vivid detail. "You sure about this?" Matt asked, his hand hovering over the car door handle. "No," I admitted, "but I don't have a choice." The house was eerily quiet as we stepped inside, the air thick with an unexplainable heaviness. It felt like stepping into another world, one where time didn't exist and the walls themselves were alive. We set up the equipment quickly, positioning cameras and motion sensors in every room. Matt placed a recorder at the top of the basement stairs, his hands trembling as he adjusted the settings. "This thing, whatever it is, it wants you," he said. "Stay close to me. Don't do anything stupid." I nodded, though I wasn't sure how much his words would matter once the voice returned. As we finished setting up, the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the house into darkness. The stage was set. All we had to do now was wait. The house seemed different the moment we stepped inside. The oppressive silence I remembered from before was gone, replaced by something worse, an unsettling, almost rhythmic noise. It wasn't loud, but it was there. Faint whispers that seemed to bleed from the walls, footsteps echoing faintly through the house as though someone, or something, was pacing just out of sight. Matt and I exchanged uneasy glances as we stepped into the living room, the floorboards creaking beneath our feet. The air was thick, heavy with an unnatural chill that felt like it was sinking into my bones. "Are you hearing that?" I whispered, my breath visible in the cold air. Matt nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, it's everywhere." We moved quickly, setting up cameras in every corner of the room, their red recording lights blinking like tiny beacons in the darkness. Matt placed an EMF meter on the coffee table and another by the basement door, both of them flashing faintly even before we had a chance to turn on the rest of the equipment. "Something's already here," Matt said, his voice tense. "These levels shouldn't be this high." I swallowed hard, gripping the flashlight in my hand like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. The whispers were growing louder now, overlapping until they formed an almost rhythmic chant. And then, clear and distinct, I heard it. "Aaron." My heart jumped into my throat. The voice was louder than before, no longer the faint, distorted sound from the recordings. It was here, in the room with us. The temperature plummeted further, the cold biting at my skin as the voice came again, more insistent. "Aaron, Aaron." Matt grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the hallway. "We need to move. If it's already this strong, we can't just stay here. We need to draw it out, figure out where it's coming from." We moved through the house, the flashlight's beam jittering across the walls as my hands shook. The whispers followed us, growing louder and more chaotic with every step. It was as if the house itself were alive, each creak and groan of the floorboards adding to the cacophony. When we reached the basement door, the EMF meter spiked violently, its beeping almost deafening. Matt glanced at me, his expression grim. "It's down there," he said. "I know," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. We set up another camera at the top of the stairs, pointing it toward the yawning darkness below. The door creaked open slightly on its own, and I couldn't tell if it was the draft or something far worse that had moved it. As Matt adjusted the settings on the camera, I stared into the blackness of the basement, the flashlight barely cutting through the dense shadows. The whispers had stopped now, replaced by an eerie silence that made my ears ring. And then, the voice returned. "Aaron." It was louder this time, echoing up from the basement like a low growl. The sound vibrated in my chest, filling the air with an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. Matt reached for the door to close it, but before he could, the voice roared. "Stay." The force of it was physical, a shockwave that slammed the door wide open and sent us both stumbling backward. The flashlight slipped from my hand, its beams spinning wildly across the walls before landing at the foot of the stairs. Jesus Christ, Matt gasped, scrambling to his feet. What the hell was that? Before I could answer, the shadows at the bottom of the stairs began to shift. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly, but as the seconds passed, the darkness seemed to take on a life of its own. The shadows grew thicker, stretching and twisting into impossible shapes. And then it emerged. The figure was taller than I remembered, its hunched form nearly brushing the ceiling as it ascended the stairs. Its limbs were impossibly long, its movements deliberate and grotesque, as though it were being puppeteered by some unseen force. The void where its face should have been seemed darker than the rest of its form, a gaping abyss that devoured the light around it. Matt was shouting something, words I couldn't make out over the pounding in my ears, but his voice was swallowed by the deep, guttural growl that filled the room. The figure stopped at the top of the stairs, its head tilting slightly as if it were studying us. And then, it spoke. "Aaron, you belong to me." The words hit me like a physical blow, and my vision blurred as an icy weight pressed down on my chest. I stumbled backward, barely aware of Matt grabbing my arm and trying to pull me toward the front door. "Move. We need to get out of here," Matt shouted, his voice shaking. But I couldn't move. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, as though it had all the time in the world. The air around it seemed to shimmer, distorting reality itself. Matt yanked at me again, his grip tightening as the figure reached out a long, claw-like hand. "Aaron, we have to go." The voice came again, louder and more insistent. "Aaron, stay." I don't remember much after that. There was a blinding flash of light, a deafening roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The ground beneath me shook violently, and for a moment, I thought the entire house was collapsing. When I came to, I was lying in the front yard, the cold grass pressing against my face. Matt was crouched beside me, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice tight with panic. I nodded weakly, my head pounding as I tried to sit up. The house loomed behind him, dark and silent once more. The oppressive presence I'd felt inside was gone, but the memory of it lingered, a heavy weight that pressed down on my chest. "We can't go back in there," Matt said, helping me to my feet. "Whatever that thing is, it's not just a spirit or some leftover energy. It's something else, and it wants you." We left that night, driving in silence as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. But even as we put miles between us and the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The voice still echoed in my mind, deep and final. "You belong to me." I woke up to the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor and the sterile white light of a hospital room. My head felt like it had been split open, a dull, pounding ache radiating from my temples. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then, it all came rushing back. The house, the figure, the voice. "Aaron, you're awake." I turned my head slowly to see Matt sitting in the chair by the bed, his face pale and drawn. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, dark circles under his bloodshot eyes. "What happened?" I croaked, my throat dry and raw. Matt hesitated, glancing down at his hands. "I found you unconscious in the living room," he said finally. "You were just lying there." The house was completely quiet. No footsteps, no voices, nothing. It was like whatever was there just stopped. His words sent a chill down my spine. I struggled to sit up, wincing as the pain in my head flared. "What about the cameras? The equipment? Did you check the footage?" Matt's jaw tightened, and he shook his head. "There wasn't anything on the footage, Aaron. No voices, no shadows, nothing. It's like it didn't want to be recorded." "That's impossible," I said, my voice trembling. "We saw it. We both saw it." "I know," Matt said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But there's nothing to prove it. It's like the house erased itself. Or maybe it erased us." Matt refused to say much more after that. Every time I pressed him for details, he'd just shake his head, his eyes distant and haunted. I could tell he was holding something back, but I didn't have the energy to push him. I spent another day in the hospital, hooked up to machines and under the watchful eyes of the nurses. They told me I was dehydrated and suffering from exhaustion, but I knew it was more than that. The house had taken something from me, something I couldn't name, but I could feel the absence of it, like a hole in my chest. When I was discharged, Matt drove me back to his apartment. He insisted I stay with him for a few days, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow in the corners of the room felt alive. Every creak of the floorboards made my heart race. The nightmares started that first night. In the dream, I was back in the house. The air was thick and cold, the walls pulsing with a faint, otherworldly light. The basement door stood wide open, the darkness beyond it stretching out endlessly. The voice came, louder and more insistent than ever. "Aaron, come home." I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. For a moment, I thought I could still hear the voice, faint and echoing in the room. "Aaron, come home." It didn't feel like a dream. It felt like a warning. The next morning, I made the decision to sell the house. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't even think about stepping foot inside again. I called a realtor, explaining that I needed to sell as quickly as possible. She didn't ask many questions, though I could tell she was curious about my sudden urgency. By the end of the day, the house was listed, and I felt a small flicker of relief. But the nightmares didn't stop. Every night, I dreamed of the house. The layout would shift and twist, the rooms bleeding into each other in impossible ways. No matter where I went in the dream, the basement door was always there, waiting for me. And the voice was always the same. "Aaron, come home." Weeks passed, and the house sold faster than I expected. The new owners didn't ask any questions, and I didn't volunteer any information. I signed the papers and handed over the keys, hoping that would be the end of it. But it wasn't. The feeling of being watched never went away. The shadows in Matt's apartment felt heavier, darker, like they were hiding something just out of sight. Sometimes, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, certain I'd heard footsteps outside my door, and the voice followed me. It started faint, barely a whisper at the edge of my consciousness, but it grew louder with each passing night, more insistent. "Aaron, come home." One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I got out of bed and paced the living room, my mind racing. Was I going insane? Was the voice real, or was it just some lingering trauma from the house? I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at my phone. My hands trembled as I pulled up the listing for the house. It was still there, the same familiar photo of the front yard and porch staring back at me. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but as I scrolled through the photos, a cold dread settled over me. In one of the images, a shot of the living room, I could see it. The figure. It was faint, barely visible in the shadows by the basement door. But it was there, its hunched form unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the screen. The figure seemed to shift, its outline blurring, as though it were watching me through the photo. And then the voice came again, louder than ever. "Aaron, you never left." I dropped the phone, stumbling back from the table as the air around me grew colder. My chest tightened, and I could feel it, the same oppressive presence I'd felt in the house. It was here. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, but eventually, the room grew still again. The voice didn't return, but the feeling of dread lingered, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I haven't slept since that night. Every time I close my eyes, I see the house. I hear the voice, louder now, more insistent. "Aaron, come home." I don't know what it wants. I don't know why it chose me, but I can feel it getting closer. And I'm starting to wonder, maybe I never truly left that house.